The courthouse didn't look dramatic from the outside, just beige stone and glass reflecting a dull morning sky. But the moment Kody Brown stepped inside, something invisible cracked. Because this wasn't a reunion or a family meeting or another carefully edited conversation meant for cameras. This was a place where words didn't get softened and choices didn't get explained away. And the first thing people noticed wasn't what he was wearing or how he carried himself. It was that he came in alone, no arm linked with a wife, no shared smile, just a stiff nod to a security guard who, clearly, had no idea he was watching a family fracture in real time. And a few steps ahead of him sat Meri, already seated, hands folded too tightly in her lap, staring straight ahead like if she turned even slightly she might lose the nerve she'd spent years building. While across the aisle Christine stood instead of sitting, her posture calm, but her jaw set in a way that said, this wasn't fear, it was resolve. And Janelle hovered near the back row, flipping through papers she already knew by heart. The kind of papers you only gather when you've realized love won't protect you anymore. And then there was Robyn, arriving last, slipping into the room beside Kody just as the bailiff called for everyone to rise, her fingers brushing his sleeve for a fraction of a second. Not enough to comfort him, but enough to signal alignment, and in that tiny gesture, the entire room felt it. The unspoken question of who still stood together and who had already stepped away, and when the judge entered and took her seat, her eyes scanned the room, not like a fan or a critic, but like someone measuring the weight of years that couldn't be summarized in a filing. And the case number was read aloud, neutral and cold, reducing decades of shared vows into something procedural, something that could be opened, examined, and possibly dismantled. And as everyone sat, the silence grew heavy, not awkward, but expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. Because this wasn't about divorce in the traditional sense. There was no simple separation to argue over. This was about promises made privately and enforced emotionally. About a family structure that operated on trust rather than law. And the moment Meri's attorney stood and requested the sealed petition be unsealed for the court even, Kody's expression shifted, just slightly. Because sealed petitions meant receipts, timelines, and things that couldn't be brushed aside with philosophy or faith. And when the judge asked if all parties understood the nature of the proceedings, Christine answered before anyone else. Her voice steady, saying yes, she understood perfectly, while Janelle nodded slowly like someone bracing for impact, and Robyn hesitated a beat too long before agreeing, and Kody said nothing at all, which in itself felt loud. And if you're wondering why no one looked relieved yet, it's because everyone in that room already knew the truth hurts most when it's finally organized, because the petition wasn't emotional, it was methodical, laying out agreements the family had lived by for years, how money flowed into a shared pool, how decisions were supposed to be made collectively, how time and attention were promised to be distributed fairly. And as the judge read silently, her brow furrowed, not in shock, but in recognition. Because she'd seen this before, informal systems that worked only as long as power stayed balanced, and when imbalance crept in, the system collapsed from the inside. And Meri's hands trembled, just enough to give her away. Not because she regretted filing, but because once something like this is spoken in a courtroom, it can never be unheard. And Christine finally sat down, exhaling slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for years, while Janelle stared at the judge with a look that wasn't anger or sadness but exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying both loyalty and logic at the same time. And Robyn shifted again, eyes darting briefly toward Meri before fixing back on the bench. And when the judge asked who had initiated the request for financial disclosure, Meri's lawyer answered calmly, but the words landed hard, because financial disclosure meant transparency, and transparency was the one thing this family had avoided naming outright. And Kody leaned toward his attorney, whispering something quick and sharp. His confidence, cracking just enough to be noticed, and for the first time, the image he'd worked so hard to project felt fragile. Not because he was being accused of something dramatic, but because systems only survive when everyone agrees they're fair. And this system was about to be tested under oath. And right here is where people usually pick sides. But the truth is, this story doesn't belong to just one wife. Because as the judge ordered the submission of financial records and private communications relevant to shared assets, Christine closed her eyes for a moment, like she already knew what would surface, while Janelle's fingers paused mid-page, and Robyn's lips pressed together tightly. A silent calculation playing behind her eyes, and the judge reminded everyone that the court wasn't there to judge beliefs or lifestyles, only actions and agreements. A statement that sounded neutral, but landed like a warning, because beliefs had been used for years to justify actions that were never written down. And when the judge announced that testimony would begin with the petitioner, Meri looked up for the first time, meeting Kody's gaze across the room. Not with anger, but with something quieter and more dangerous. Certainty. And Kody looked away first. The movement small, but telling, because avoidance speaks volumes when words are about to be sworn. And the bailiff called a short recess to allow counsel to prepare. The room erupted into whispered conversations, chairs scraping softly against the floor. But none of the wives spoke to each other. Not then, not yet. Because whatever sisterhood had existed before had already shifted into something else, something more individual. And as Meri stood to leave the room, Christine's eyes followed her with a mixture of respect and unresolved hurt, while Janelle gathered her papers like armor, and Robyn stayed seated. One hand on Kody's knee now, firmer than before, as if grounding both of them. And if this still feels calm, remember, this is the quiet before every truth finally finds its voice. Because when the judge returned and called the court back to order, the room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls themselves were listening, and Meri was called forward to take the stand. Her steps measured, her face composed but pale, and as she raised her hand to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, the weight of that promise hung heavier than any vow she'd ever made before, because this time, there was no family meeting afterward to smooth things over, no private conversation to redefine what was meant, no camera to cut away at the hardest part, just a microphone, a judge, and a story that had waited far too long to be told. And just before she opened her mouth to speak, the judge leaned forward and said calmly that any evidence presented would become part of the public record. And the ripple that moved through the room wasn't fear, it was realization. That whatever happened next would change not only how the family saw itself, but how the world did too. And as Meri took a breath, steadying herself, Kody shifted in his seat again, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Because somewhere between shared dreams and shared accounts, something had broken. And now, under oath, it was about to be named. And what Meri says next doesn't just start the case, it decides who this family really was all along. Because the first words out of her mouth weren't accusations or bitterness, but a simple sentence that landed like a crack in glass. Quiet, but irreversible, as she said she had believed in the family rules until the day she realized they no longer applied to her, and the courtroom leaned in, knowing this was only the beginning. Because once one truth is spoken out loud, the rest don't stay silent for long. Meri didn't rush her testimony, and that alone shifted the energy in the room, because everyone expected anger or tears or at least a rehearsed statement. But instead she spoke slowly, like someone finally allowed to finish a sentence that had been interrupted for years, explaining that when she entered the marriage, she believed structure meant safety, that shared rules meant shared protection, and that being the first wife meant being a foundation, not a leftover. And as she described the early years, her voice stayed even, almost nostalgic, until she reached the moment when decisions started happening without her. Not announced openly, not debated, just quietly implemented. And she described how conversations would end with phrases like, "This is best for the family," even when she wasn't sure which family that meant anymore. And Kody stared straight ahead, jaw tight, while Robyn shifted in her seat, her foot tapping just enough to betray discomfort. And when Meri's lawyer asked her to explain what changed, Meri didn't point to a single fight or betrayal. She pointed to a pattern, the slow redrawing of boundaries that only seemed to apply to some wives and not others. Explaining how time allocation shifted, how financial contributions were expected without equal say, how emotional distance was framed as her failure to adapt rather than a shared responsibility, and the courtroom stayed quiet not because it was polite, but because it was absorbing something painfully familiar. And here's the moment where you realize this isn't about one argument, it's about years of being quietly rewritten. Because Meri described how she tried to adjust, tried to be patient, tried to earn her way back into relevance, until the rules stopped being clear altogether. And when her lawyer introduced the first exhibit, a series of messages outlining changes to shared financial plans that she was never consulted on, the judge leaned forward, not to judge intent, but to understand process, asking Meri whether she had agreed to these changes. And Meri answered, simply that agreement requires a choice, and she was only ever informed after the fact, and that answer landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it reframed the issue from emotional neglect to structural exclusion. And when Robyn's attorney objected, citing family dynamics rather than legal contracts, the judge overruled calmly, reminding the room that patterns of conduct matter when determining reliance and harm. And Meri nodded slightly, like someone finally being understood, and she went on to describe how money wasn't just money in their family, it was power, security, and validation, explaining how contributions were framed as sacrifices for unity, while withdrawals were justified as necessities for stability. And stability, she implied without naming it, often seemed to follow one household more than the others. And when her lawyer asked if she ever raised concerns, Meri answered yes, many times. But those conversations ended with silence or spiritual language that left no room for disagreement. And Kody's attorney scribbled notes rapidly, while Kody himself finally looked up, his expression controlled but no longer confident. And the judge asked Meri why she didn't leave sooner. And that question cracked something open, because Meri paused, swallowed, and said leaving felt like admitting the entire life she'd built had been conditional, and that staying felt like the only way to preserve meaning. And this is where the room shifts, because loyalty suddenly looks a lot like fear. And Meri described the moment she realized the system wasn't broken accidentally, it was functioning exactly as designed for someone else's comfort. Recounting a specific incident where she was told a financial decision had already been made for the greater good, and when she asked who's good, the conversation ended, and that was the first time she started documenting things. Not to use against anyone, but to understand her own reality. And when those documents were entered into evidence, timelines aligning with emotional milestones the audience already recognized. Christine closed her eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in confirmation, while Janelle's pen stopped moving entirely, and Robyn crossed her arms, posture defensive now, and the judge asked Meri whether she believed the favoritism was intentional, and Meri answered carefully, saying intent matters less than impact. Because regardless of whether it was planned, it was experienced, and that experience reshaped every relationship in the family. And as the testimony continued, Meri spoke about isolation not as abandonment, but as invisibility, describing holidays where she was present but not included, decisions discussed in private that affected her publicly, and expectations placed on her without the authority to negotiate them. And when her lawyer asked if she felt she was treated equally, Meri answered no without hesitation. And that single word echoed louder than any dramatic outburst could have. And if you're feeling tension now, it's because this isn't explosive yet. It's surgical. Because the most damaging truths are the ones delivered calmly. And when cross-examination began, Kody's attorney tried to reframe Meri's experience as miscommunication, suggesting she misunderstood intentions or misread dynamics. And Meri listened patiently before responding that misunderstandings don't last a decade without clarification, and that silence repeated becomes policy. And the judge nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing the difference between confusion and neglect. And when Robyn's attorney asked whether Meri resented Robyn's entry into the family, Meri didn't flinch, saying resentment implies competition. And she had stopped competing long before Robyn arrived. She had been trying to survive within a system that no longer saw her. And that answer changed the temperature in the room, because it stripped the narrative of jealousy and replaced it with endurance. And Robyn's foot stopped tapping altogether, her gaze fixed on the table. And when the judge asked Meri what she wanted from the court, Meri didn't ask for punishment or validation. She asked for acknowledgement, for clarity, for the rules to be named out loud so no one else would have to guess whether they still mattered. And that request reframed the entire case, because it wasn't about revenge, it was about reckoning. And as Meri stepped down from the stand, the courtroom exhaled collectively, like everyone had been holding their breath without realizing it. And Christine watched her return to her seat with something like gratitude, while Janelle stared ahead, her expression unreadable but heavy. And Robyn finally looked up, her eyes flicking between the judge and Kody, calculating what this testimony meant for what came next. And if you think this was the hardest part, remember this was only the first voice, because the judge announced a brief recess before calling the next witness. And as people stood, Kody remained seated, shoulders tense, the image of control slipping further with each passing minute. And Meri didn't look back at him, not out of spite, but because she no longer needed his reaction to validate her truth. And in that quiet shift, the power in the room changed hands. Because once one wife speaks clearly, the silence protecting everyone else starts to crack. And as the judge called the court back to order and announced that Janelle would be next to testify, the air thickened again, not with anticipation, but with dread. Because numbers don't lie the way memories can. And Janelle wasn't known for emotion. She was known for facts. And as she stood, gathering her papers, the realization settled over the room that whatever came next wouldn't just deepen the story, it would reframe it entirely. Because Meri had shown how the system felt, and Janelle was about to show how it functioned. And that combination was far more dangerous than either alone. Janelle walked to the stand without hesitation. But the room felt different the moment she sat down, Because unlike Meri, who carried years of unspoken hurt, Janelle carried numbers, timelines, and the kind of calm that comes from already knowing the answers. And when she raised her hand to swear the oath, her voice was steady, almost detached, as if she had already mourned this moment long before it arrived. And when her lawyer asked her to describe her role in the family, Janelle didn't speak about romance or spiritual calling. She spoke about responsibility, explaining that she had always been the one who tracked expenses, planned budgets, and tried to make sense of how 4 households could function as one. And she described how in the early years, the system worked because decisions were discussed openly, even when they were difficult, and everyone understood what they were giving and why. But she explained that over time, the conversation stopped being collective and started becoming selective, with decisions announced after they were already made. And she admitted that at first she rationalized it as efficiency, telling herself that someone had to move things forward. But that belief began to crack when the math stopped lining up. And the judge leaned forward slightly when Janelle said that. Because math, unlike memory, leaves very little room for interpretation. And as Janelle began laying out dates and amounts, the courtroom grew quiet in a different way than before, less emotionally charged and more alert, like everyone suddenly realized this wasn't just a family dispute, it was a system under audit. And she explained how family funds were presented as shared resources, but over time, contributions increased from some wives while access narrowed. And she said she noticed patterns where requests from certain households were approved quickly, while others were delayed, questioned, or denied outright. And when her lawyer asked her if she ever raised concerns, Janelle nodded and said she did, multiple times. But those concerns were reframed as negativity or a lack of faith in the family vision, and she described the pressure of being labeled difficult simply for asking how decisions were being made. And this is where the tension tightens, because when logic gets dismissed as disloyalty, the system starts to eat itself. And Janelle explained that the moment she truly panicked wasn't emotional, it was procedural. When she realized there was no written agreement, no formal protection for the sacrifices being made, just trust layered on top of tradition. And she admitted that she stayed longer than she should have, because she believed stability mattered more than fairness, especially for the kids. And when the judge asked her why she didn't insist on formal contracts earlier, Janelle answered honestly that pushing too hard would have been seen as threatening the family itself. And she wasn't ready to be the one blamed for breaking it. And that answer landed heavily, because it revealed how silence was enforced not through punishment, but through fear of being the villain. And as Janelle continued, she described a specific period when major financial decisions were made without full disclosure, explaining how she discovered discrepancies not through conversation, but through paperwork that didn't match what she'd been told. And when her lawyer entered those documents into evidence, the judge examined them carefully, asking clarifying questions that made it clear she understood exactly what she was looking at. And Kody shifted in his seat again, more visibly this time, his attorney leaning in to whisper something that didn't seem to reassure him. And Robyn's posture stiffened, her arms crossed tightly now, as if bracing for a story she already knew, but hoped wouldn't be told this way. And when Janelle was asked whether she believed one wife was favored financially, she paused. Not because she didn't know, but because she understood the weight of saying it out loud. And when she finally answered yes, the room felt like it tilted, not dramatically, but undeniably. Because confirmation from the most practical voice in the family carried a different kind of authority. And Janelle clarified that favoritism didn't always look like extravagance. Sometimes it looked like security, like not having to justify needs, like decisions being made with confidence instead of negotiation. And she admitted that watching that dynamic unfold slowly changed how she viewed the marriage itself. And if you're feeling the unease now, it's because this isn't about betrayal. It's about realization. Because Janelle described the exact moment she stopped believing the system could be fixed. When she was told to trust a process without being shown what the process actually was, and she explained that trust without transparency isn't trust at all. It's compliance. And the judge nodded subtly at that, recognizing a principle that extended far beyond this family. And when cross-examination began, Kody's attorney attempted to frame Janelle as financially controlling, suggesting she use numbers to assert dominance. And Janelle responded calmly that tracking shared resources isn't control, it's stewardship, and that without information, no one can consent meaningfully to sacrifice. And that answer shifted the narrative again, because it reframed her role from enforcer to protector. And when Robyn's attorney asked whether Janelle resented decisions made for the good of the family, Janelle answered that she resented being told what was good without being asked what it cost. And Robyn looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together, while Christine stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable but intent. And the judge asked Janelle whether she believed the imbalance was intentional or circumstantial, and Janelle answered that intent becomes irrelevant when outcomes repeat themselves consistently and that patterns reveal priorities whether anyone admits them or not. And that sentence hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be delivered. And this is the point where the story stops being emotional and starts becoming undeniable, because numbers don't cry. They don't exaggerate. They simply exist. And Janelle continued by explaining how she eventually separated her finances, not as rebellion, but as self-preservation. And she admitted that doing so made her feel like she was betraying the family, even though she was protecting herself. And the judge asked whether she felt supported during that time. And Janelle shook her head slightly, saying support was conditional on silence. And once she stopped being quiet, the support faded. And that revelation rippled through the room, because it explained why so many concerns had gone unspoken for so long. And when Janelle stepped down from the stand, she didn't look relieved. She looked resolved, like someone who had finally put something heavy down. And as she returned to her seat, Christine met her eyes briefly, a silent exchange passing between them. Not of alliance, but of mutual recognition, while Meri sat very still, absorbing how Janelle's testimony validated parts of her own without repeating them. And Robyn leaned closer to Kody now, whispering something urgent, while Kody nodded absently, his confidence visibly eroding with each confirmed detail. And if you think this was about money alone, you're missing the deeper fracture. Because what Janelle had exposed wasn't just imbalance, it was the mechanism that allowed imbalance to persist. And as the judge called for a short recess, the courtroom buzzed with restrained energy. Lawyers conferring quietly, spectators shifting in their seats, but the wives remained separate, each sitting in her own silence, processing what had been said and what still hadn't. And when the judge returned and announced that Christine would be the next to testify, a murmur moved through the room. Not because Christine was unexpected, but because everyone understood what her testimony represented. The emotional counterpart to Meri's experience and Janelle's evidence. And as Christine stood, smoothing her hands against her skirt before walking forward, the realization settled heavily over the courtroom that what came next wouldn't be about systems or numbers, but about the human cost of living inside them. And that cost, once named, would be impossible to ignore. Because Janelle had shown how the family functioned on paper, and Christine was about to show how it felt to live inside that reality every single day. Christine didn't hurry to the stand, but she didn't hesitate either. And that balance alone told the room this testimony would be different. Because she wasn't carrying spreadsheets or sealed folders, she was carrying something far heavier. The lived memory of being present in a marriage while slowly disappearing inside it. And when she raised her hand and swore to tell the truth, her voice didn't waver. Not because it was easy, but because she had already told herself this story enough times to know exactly where it began and where it broke. And when her lawyer asked her to describe her role in the family, Christine smiled faintly and said she was the one who kept things light, who smoothed over tension, who told herself that love meant flexibility. And as she spoke, the courtroom felt almost deceptively calm, like the eye of a storm, because she talked about laughter, children, shared meals, and the belief that emotional sacrifice was part of the calling. But then her tone shifted, not dramatically, just enough to be felt, as she explained how being the emotional glue slowly turned into being the emotional sponge, absorbing disappointment so others wouldn't have to face it. And she described how she learned to measure her worth by how little she needed, how she praised herself for being low maintenance, not realizing that she was training everyone around her to expect less from her and give less in return. And Kody watched her now, expression guarded, while Robyn stared straight ahead, unmoving. And when Christine described the first time she realized she was no longer competing for time but being excluded from it, the room leaned in. Because exclusion sounds quieter than rejection, but it cuts deeper. And she explained how schedules changed, how conversations happened without her, how plans were framed as logistics rather than choices, and how she was told she was imagining the distance because she was too sensitive. And the judge's pen paused mid-note at that phrase, because minimizing emotional experience is a familiar pattern in many cases. And Christine continued, explaining how she internalized that criticism, telling herself that if she just adjusted her expectations, everything would stabilize. And this is where the tension tightens again, because when someone starts shrinking to survive, the damage becomes invisible. And Christine described holidays that felt lonelier than ordinary days. Moments when she watched affection being given freely elsewhere, while she waited for scraps of attention that never quite came. And she clarified that it wasn't about jealousy, it was about consistency, about promises that were spoken publicly and broken privately. And when her lawyer asked her to describe the turning point, Christine paused for the first time, her composure cracking just enough to show the weight underneath. And she said the turning point wasn't one fight. It was a realization. The moment she understood she was teaching her children that love meant enduring neglect. And that realization terrified her more than being alone ever could. And the courtroom shifted at that, because the narrative widened from marriage to legacy, from personal pain to generational consequence. And when Christine explained how she finally stopped asking for more and started planning for less, the judge looked up, meeting her gaze directly, recognizing the clarity that comes when someone crosses the line from hope into acceptance. And Christine explained that once she emotionally stepped back, everything became clearer. The favoritism, the imbalance, the way certain needs were prioritized while others were dismissed as inconvenient. And when she confirmed that these patterns aligned with the timelines already presented by Meri and Janelle, the case stopped feeling like separate grievances and started feeling like a single story told from different angles. And if you're feeling the weight now, It's because this is the point where denial runs out of places to hide. And during cross-examination, Kody's attorney attempted to reframe Christine's experience as a natural evolution of relationships, suggesting that feelings change over time and that not all emotional needs can be met equally. And Christine listened, nodding slightly, before responding that change is inevitable, but neglect is a choice, and that emotional needs don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. And that answer drew a quiet murmur from the courtroom, quickly silenced, but impossible to erase. And when Robyn's attorney asked Christine whether she believed her expectations were unrealistic, Christine answered without hesitation that expecting honesty and consistency isn't unrealistic, it's foundational. And Robyn finally shifted in her seat, her composure tightening, and the judge asked Christine whether she ever felt pressured to stay quiet for the sake of the family image, and Christine laughed softly, not with humor, but with recognition, saying that silence was always framed as strength, and speaking up was framed as selfishness. And that dynamic kept her quiet far longer than love ever did. And that statement landed heavily, because it explained the invisible rules that govern the family more clearly than any document could. And this is the moment where the story stops asking who's right and starts asking who paid the price. And Christine described the night she finally decided to leave emotionally. A quiet moment after everyone else was asleep, when she realized that staying was no longer an act of devotion, but an act of erasure. And she admitted that walking away didn't feel brave at first. It felt like failure, until she realized that choosing herself wasn't abandoning the family. It was refusing to disappear for it. And the judge listened intently, asking only one question: whether Christine believed reconciliation was ever possible once these truths were acknowledged. And Christine answered honestly that reconciliation requires mutual accountability. And she had been the only one doing the accounting for too long. And that answer seemed to hang in the air, heavy and final. And when Christine stepped down from the stand, she didn't look broken or relieved. She looked lighter, like someone who had finally put language to something that had lived inside her unspoken for years. And Meri watched her with quiet understanding, while Janelle nodded once, subtly, as if confirming that the emotional narrative now matched the financial one. And Robyn leaned closer to Kody again, whispering urgently, while Kody's face hardened, his posture shifting from defensive to rigid. And that shift didn't go unnoticed by the judge. And if you think this testimony ended the uncertainty, it actually sharpened it, because Christine hadn't just described pain. She had described pattern, and patterns demand explanation. And as the judge called the court to order and announced that the next phase would involve direct testimony from Kody himself, the room seemed to contract, the air thick with anticipation. Because everything up until now had been about how the system felt and how it functioned. But the architect of that system hadn't yet spoken, and as Kody stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, avoiding eye contact with every wife in the room, the realization settled heavily over everyone present that whatever he said next wouldn't just defend his choices, it would define them, because silence had protected him for years, and now, under oath, he was about to learn whether words could still do the same. Kody stood when his name was called, adjusting his jacket like armor, and the courtroom felt smaller the moment he took the stand, not because he was intimidating, but because for the first time the structure everyone had been describing now had a voice. And when he swore to tell the truth, his tone was confident, almost rehearsed, the sound of someone used to explaining himself. And he began by framing everything as leadership, responsibility, and the impossible task of balancing 4 marriages under constant pressure, saying no one could understand the weight he carried unless they'd lived. It, and as he spoke, he leaned heavily on intention, insisting he never meant to hurt anyone, never meant to exclude, never meant to favor, and the judge listened patiently, allowing him space to build his narrative, because stories reveal more in how they're told than what they claim. And when his attorney guided him through questions about family agreements, Kody spoke in broad strokes, describing conversations rather than commitments, values rather than terms, and the courtroom began to recognize the pattern, that everything important was implied, but nothing was ever defined. And when the judge asked him directly whether all wives had equal say in financial decisions, Kody hesitated just long enough to be noticed before answering that equality doesn't always look identical. And that phrase landed hard, because it echoed the justification that had been quietly unraveling the family. For years, and Meri shifted in her seat, Christine's jaw tightened, and Janelle stared straight ahead, unmoving. And this is the moment when the tone changes, because justification is no longer enough. And under cross-examination, Kody was pressed on specifics, dates, conversations, messages, and with each question, his answers narrowed, becoming more defensive, more circular, until the judge interrupted to clarify whether certain decisions had been discussed collectively or communicated individually, and when Kody admitted some decisions were handled privately for efficiency, the judge asked whose efficiency he was prioritizing, and that question broke the rhythm of his testimony, because it stripped away philosophy and demanded accountability. And Robyn shifted beside him, her hand lifting slightly as if to reach for him before stopping. And when the judge asked Robyn to take the stand next, the room reacted with a collective intake of breath, because Robyn wasn't just another witness. She was the axis everything seemed to turn on. And when she sat down, her demeanor was soft, careful, almost fragile, and she spoke about love, misunderstanding, and being blamed for dynamics she never asked for, insisting she never wanted favoritism, and that she believed the family was still salvageable. But as questions tightened, timelines were laid beside actions, and the softness began to strain, because explanations stopped lining up with evidence. And when the judge asked her about a message that had been entered into record earlier, one that showed reassurance given to her alone while others were asked to sacrifice, Robyn's voice faltered for the first time. And she said she didn't remember it that way. And the judge calmly replied that memory wasn't required when documentation existed. And right here, the story stops being about feelings and becomes about facts. And the courtroom went silent as the judge summarized what had been established, not as accusations, but as findings, noting consistent patterns of exclusion, informal agreements relied upon by some and disregarded by others, and harm caused not by a single act, but by repeated imbalance. And she reminded everyone that belief systems don't negate responsibility when reliance has been established. And when she delivered her ruling, it wasn't dramatic. It was measured, recognizing financial inequity, ordering redistribution of shared assets, and formally dissolving any implied family agreements moving forward. But the real weight of the moment wasn't in what the court took away. It was in what it named. Because, for the first time, the system that governed their lives had been spoken out loud and judged. And as the judge concluded by saying that fairness cannot survive without transparency, Kody's shoulders slumped slightly, the image of control finally gone, and Meri closed her eyes briefly, not in victory, but in release, while Janelle exhaled like someone stepping out of a storm. And Christine sat taller, steadier, like someone who had already walked through loss and found ground on the other side. And if you're wondering whether this ends in closure, it doesn't. It ends in clarity. Because as people stood and gathered their things, there were no reconciliations, no apologies, just quiet separation. Each wife leaving the courtroom on her own terms, and Kody remaining seated a moment longer, staring at the table as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves, and Robyn lingering beside him, unsure whether to comfort or confront. And as the courtroom emptied, the truth settled into the space they left behind. That love without accountability becomes power. That silence can look like loyalty until it costs too much. And that sometimes justice doesn't reunite families. It simply tells them the truth they avoided. And before you click away, ask yourself this. If you had lived inside this family, would you have stayed quiet for peace? Or spoken up knowing it might change everything? And I want you to answer that in the comments. Because stories like this don't end in courtrooms. They continue in the choices we imagine ourselves, making when silence is no longer an option.